Hi everybody. Um, my name's Dowie. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a psychotherapist and a lecturer and someone who's deeply interested in the question of trauma and trauma practice. And I'm lucky enough that the Healing Ground has asked me to come along and speak today and do some training in Adelaide as well in June. So I want to thank Prue and Deanna and Simone and all those people who made it possible for me to be here today. And I really want to thank all the people who have taken the time to provide me with some really interesting questions for this evening. And I'll do my best to answer those questions, and I'll do my best to answer them all. In terms of time, we may run out. I'm going to try and speak for about an hour. So I may not get to all your questions, but I just want you to know that doesn't mean I don't value those questions. The first question, I guess, that I want to raise from the list was the most obvious one, which is around the training in June, which is why is the training called The Lightest Touch? And there's a poem that I'm very fond of by David White, and I often use it when I'm teaching. And the poem is about poetry, but I often feel that the word poetry could very easily be supplanted by the word therapy. And so the poem that White has written, and if you've ever heard him recite his own poetry, it's a beautiful thing, and I would not be able to do it justice today, but the poem goes, good poetry begins with the lightest touch. And so I would say good therapy begins with the lightest touch. The lightest touch. A breeze arriving from nowhere. A whispered healing arrival. A word in your ear. A settling into things. And then, like a hand in the dark, it arrests the whole body. Stealing you for revelation. Stealing you for revelation. In the silence that follows a great line, you can feel Lazarus deep inside, even the laziest, most deathly afraid part of you lift up his hands and walk towards the light. And I feel that poem is beautiful, and I think it really encapsulates a lot of the sentiments that I think good trauma-focused psychotherapy is about. And that's why the title of the training is The Lightest Touch. But also, on a kind of deeper note, part of the reason for the selection of a poetic title is to say that much of trauma practice is dominated by very scientific and neurobiological approaches today, but there's a lot to be taken from, I guess, a deeper, more poetic reading of trauma and trauma practice and psychotherapy more generally. Poetry is often framed as being kind of wishy-washy, but it is anything but that when it is done well. It is, of course, a deep awareness of some of the fundamental layers of experience and existence, and the inclusion of a poetic sensibility is really important. I'm very fond of a German philosopher by the name of Theodor Adorno, and he famously said that you can't write poetry after Auschwitz, but he also famously said that the question of suffering has as much right to speak. The suffering person has as much right to speak as the tortured person does to scream. And there is this sense in which good thinking and good practice comes back to this point of Adorno's, which is to let suffering speak. For Adorno, the condition of all truth was to let suffering speak. And trauma work is, in a deep and profound way, just about that. It is about letting suffering speak. It is a way of finding what can't be said, what can't be named. Reminded by Samuel Beckett there when he said, I shall have to speak of things for which I cannot speak. That is the essence of trauma practice and work, because so much of it is locked into somatic and bodily manifestations. So much of it is disconnected from the normal cognitive functions of a person, and the effects of it are so profound. So that's why the title is The Lightest Touch. That's why they've chosen that as the title. I think Deanna may have heard me speak or give a talk once involving that, and she thought that was a lovely title. So I'm always pleased to continue on and speak in the intersection between science and poetry, and I think that's an important piece of work for us all to do. So I hope that answers the first question. The next question, I've just got a list of these questions here, so I'll just read them. The next question is from Michael. As a burgeoning therapist, how can I work with a patient who is showing signs of trauma safely? That's a difficult question. The question of working with a patient suffering from trauma safely is really about understanding best practice in trauma-focused psychotherapy. That means, as a minimum, understanding multiphasic approaches to treatment, which is very important. All best practice in trauma work should involve a really sound conceptualization around phasic treatment models. Whatever that is, I'm not sure that there's necessarily a right way or a wrong model of phasic treatment, but they all have certain things in common. Phase 1, safety, stabilization, resourcing. Phase 2, processing, memory extinguishment, etc. And then phase 3 is something to do with integration and incorporation into identity and narrative. That would be how I would kind of phrase those phases up most generally. So I think that's probably the most important factor, because if you're using a phasic model of treatment, what you'll always be doing is you'll be keyed into the great danger in trauma treatment, which is re-traumatization. So when we're using a phasic model, what we're kind of essentially always doing is returning the person to safety, returning them into tolerance. So we need the practice to be safe enough, but not too safe. And that's really how I would define trauma work, is it's the development of deep safety, but not too much safety that nothing happens. So the other side of it, I guess, would be that when we're doing trauma-focused practice, is to go much slower than you think you need to. I tell students normally, however slow you think you should be going, make it about 5 or 6 times slower and you're normally probably in the ballpark. It's very easy to miscue and misperceive pace in treatment for people suffering from particularly complex trauma. It's always much more difficult than people suffering from a generalized traumatic disorder, or sometimes called a type 1 trauma, single event, much easier to deal with. But when you're dealing with complex trauma, sometimes referred to as type 2 traumas, where you're dealing with multitudes and layers of problems, it's a much more difficult problem. And so really paying attention to time and taking your time and slowing down and focusing on that phasic model of treatment would be my general suggestions. The next question, this is from Michael as well. Van der Kolk talks about experiences of losing parts of the body, patients who can't feel at all sometimes large areas of their own body. How do you explain this from your framework? How can you use this as an access point in therapy? Well, I mean, somatic dissociation is a really important and salient factor in trauma-focused psychotherapy. It's important to understand, I guess, what's happening there is that really trauma is a memory-based disorder in some ways. So if you think about memory as a series of files in your brain, then you're about as far away from understanding memory as you can get. Memory is not that. Memory is a diffuse process that's distributed through the body. I've treated people before who have developed what is sometimes referred to as stigmata-like phenomenon. So as we're doing processing work, parts of their body will start displaying marks or redness around points of injury. This is a good example of the way in which memory can be distributed through the body more generally. When we're dealing with dissociative body parts, normally those are connected to events within the trauma itself. And the process of treatment is about bringing the body back online, expressing those parts of the body, bringing them back into awareness. If you think of a simple definition of trauma, is an experience which is too intense to be experienced. That is to say, an experience which then is relegated into the realm of non-experience. That's what dissociation is, and that's what somatic dissociation is literally the body itself is unexperienced. The part of the body itself becomes unexperienced. And this is connected to what they call structural dissociation theory. And there's lots of exponents of that are quite popular in contemporary trauma work. But the essence of it is, how do I bring safely the experience of the body back? Because when I bring the body back, I also inevitably bring the experience back. And so that becomes a very delicate line you have to balance. It can be very painful and difficult. There are a number of good techniques for that you can use. So you can do somatic resourcing activities, the type of things that Pat Ogden and alike are very big on. Simple things like manual stimulation of the areas can really help. Often I've found patients suffering from these things really benefit from a shower head that they use and massage on the part of the body that is dissociative or numb. So that would be my short answer to the question on how to use and enter into the question of somatic dissociation. But that's obviously a much bigger question and something that needs a lot of work. Okay, next question. Is secure attachment or earned attachment necessary for success in therapy? Well, that question is a little bit vague, but let me try and speak to it. So, I'm a big believer in not all people who specialise in trauma practice would agree with this point, just to say that as a caveat. I think everyone would agree that attachment work is important at some point in people's trauma work, and I know, for example, Ogden sees that as something that happens later on. From my point of view, attachment-based disorders and attachment work should be done before any of the trauma of commission work. So if you think about trauma of omission, trauma of commission, attachment disorders are connected to traumas of omission, of what wasn't provided, of neglect and lack. My experience, and this is connected to the work of Dan Brown from Harvard, and his work, and I've certainly applied this in my own practice, and to me it seems unequivocally true, is that if we stabilise the internal working model of the person, that is to say, we treat the attachment disorder, which is the foundational problem of self. If we address that and stabilise that, then what we see is that some of the commission factors actually evaporate with the omission healing. So if we can create good attachment-based treatment, what we're actually doing is fortifying the self structure, which is the thing that is damaged fundamentally in trauma anyway. And so by addressing that problem, by focusing in on attachment, then we seem to do a lot of the heavy lifting. I would say that, from my perception, when we're doing an assessment for trauma, we're screening for issues around attachment. If we think that there are attachment issues present, then we'll go to an AAI, an adult attachment inventory, and then we'll use a 3 pillars treatment approach for the attachment disorder. We do that, then we come back and reassess the trauma of commission. Normally be using a CAPS-5 or something like that for the assessment. And once we've got a clear picture, then we would proceed into the commission-based treatment. That's how I would view it anyway. This next question is an attachment question as well. If therapists are not trained in attachment and they are working with patients who are poorly attached, will they be likely to have success? Well, I think the simple answer to that is sometimes yes, sometimes no. Many therapists are instinctively quite good at responding to attachment-based problems. But, and this is the real thing, is that when we have attachment disruptions in people, the cell structure is so fragile that any attempt to try and repair that in a projective process, which is how that was originally and typically done, is quite unstable. So I'm not saying it couldn't be successful, and I know many people have had attachment repair in that model of psychotherapy, but I would say that it's not the most likely outcome, or it's certainly not the gold standard of approach, I wouldn't think. How do attachment and trauma speak to each other is the next question. Well, they speak to each other powerfully. I mean, we know that perhaps the most singularly important factor in protecting people from traumatic disorders is having a secure attachment background. So this attachment process, again, this thing that sets the foundation for a sense of self and agency, when it's disrupted, then any further disruption in life is more likely. And so secure attachment is incredibly important for understanding and protecting people in trauma. So there's that way, there's that degree to which attachment and trauma speak to each other. And then there's the other way, which is also to say that those people who are suffering from omission, neglect, etc., are also then much more likely to develop further traumatic experiences as they age and develop. If you look at something like the Acute Childhood Experiences Inventory and Research, ACEs, I think it's something like a woman suffering from an ACE score of above 5 is like 7 or 9 times or something more likely to be sexually assaulted in later life. So there is this kind of very complex relationship between early life developmental factors and then subsequent abuse as an adult. This is not at all to engage in any kind of victim blaming, but it is to pay careful attention to the circumstances by which people find themselves in abusive situations and abusive relationships. So there are more complex dimensions of that, of course. Things like repetition compulsion and other kind of more psychoanalytic factors are important as well. Do you think secure attachment is the key to the evolution of our species? This is from Sheridan. No, I don't think it's the key to our evolution, if I'm taking that in the literal sense of evolutionary theory and whatnot. I don't think that secure attachment is the key to our evolution of a species. Our species evolution is driven by forces of natural selection, and I think it's a fair stretch to put attachment as the defining factor there. But I would say that attachment and secure attachment is really important for a civilized life. And this ability to relate securely, this ability to move into relationship without hostility, which can be set up, and it's certainly not, an absolute or a guarantee. I mean, around 60% of the population in a country like Australia already is securely attached. It's not to say that that's enough, but it's an important it's an important ground for us to move into, is to have a space where we can be loving and kind and tender and gentle with each other as fellow human beings. I think that's very important. I think that that's probably one of the most important factors, actually, for our continuance as a civilization, which is one that we might want to live in. Too often we become indifferent to each other and too indifferent to other people's suffering. Remembering Adorno's position there that the condition of all truth is to let suffering speak. I'm reminded by William James when he said, indifference is the trait that will make the very angels weep. And so I don't think it's so much about attachment generally, but it's about what attachment is the prototype for, which is love and connection. And I think that that is, you know, as Californian as that might sound, it's a necessary thing for us as a species to create a world that we want to live in. So, yeah, they're my thoughts on that. The next question is an interesting one, which is, does masochism ever become a feature of individuals who are subjected to torture? So, does masochism ever become a feature? Yep, it certainly does sometimes. It's not always. It's not by necessity that if someone is tortured, will they develop masochism or sadomasochistic tendencies. That's not by necessity true, but it is important to understand that most people suffering from masochism have some kind of history of suffering. Now, if you think about the process of masochism, what it's really saying is that there is an unconscious mechanism at play. There's an unconscious mechanism, a repetition compulsion, where the person is seeking mastery of the pain in some way. That's the psychoanalytic reading of it anyway. One of the classic characteristics of people who are both sadistic or masochistic in nature is, strong senses of denial, strong rationales for how their behaviours are actually expressions of freedom and liberty and other such ideas. But really at the core of these intersecting, though still complete, psychological manifestations, is a process whereby the person, the human, becomes where the human becomes a thing rather than a person. So, that to me is the key dimension of the masochist. So that's really why sometimes people who've been tortured go down that path, unfortunately. So yes, people who are suffering from or who have suffered at the hands of torturers can develop masochistic tendencies. That's not to blame them at all, but it is an important to be aware of. Okay. Next question I have here is from Bindi. How do you get clients to move out of panic and hypervigilance enough to affect any change? I understand that the executive function of the brain cannot be accessed when in elevated states. That's a great question, Bindi. For me, the question of hypervigilance really requires us to think really deeply about the process of vigilance itself and what's going on. And as you're saying, executive functions can be, turned off and whatnot, but I think you have to take your reading of that a little bit deeper, Bindi, and think about the ways in which the autonomic nervous system is orientated to its environment. What Stephen Porges speaks about is neuroception. So these neuroceptive processes That is to say, perception without awareness. When someone is hypervigilant, what we're really seeing is a movement out of a kind of ventral vagal orientation, and we're seeing them in a sympathetic fight or flight arousal state. That needs to be taken seriously, and what we need to do is we need to autonomically cue the person. So we need to cue to their autonomic environment, and we need to start creating inputs for the current environment they're in versus the unprocessed and unintegrated memories of their history. This can be done in really interesting ways, and there's a lot of work out there now on polyvagal theory and its applications in clinical treatment. But very, very simply, it's about generating an environment that speaks to the autonomic functioning of the person. So that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to pay really careful attention to any of the cues in the environment that may be activating that vigilance. The other thing that we can try to do is to use the other dimension that Porges is famous for, which is the ventral vagal engagement, which is the social engagement system. So what we can do is we can recognize that that vagal process, both the ventral and the dorsal vagal dimensions, are designed to create functioning or balance in the nervous system. And one collapses and one moves into social engagement. So when someone's super vigilant, what we can do is actually use our social engagement system, the tone of our voice, the reciprocity of our voice, our face, our eye contact. We can use all those dimensions to help try and engage that social dimension of the person we're treating. And if we can get that social engagement system online, what it means is that the vigilance falls away. And much of the practice with traumatized people is about teaching them how to do that. Sometimes this is referred to as engaging the vagal brake. So that becomes really, really important. So there, I guess, some of the general ideas that I would respond to that question with. I think there's some other questions here. I'm not sure how much time we have. I think we're going for another 10 minutes, I think. But I will attempt to try and do a couple other questions for you quickly. Okay, so the next question is from Jackie, and that is, Pat Ogden describes how the integration of trauma best occurs if the window of tolerance is expanded. How do we recognize if our clients are in this zone and able to process the traumatic experience? Okay, well, it's a great question, Jackie. How do we know that someone's within the window of tolerance? Well, the window of tolerance can be, I guess, recognized by people's ability to do a number of things. But most importantly, really what we're saying is, does the person have the experience, or does the experience have them? As soon as they start slipping into the experience having them, another way of saying that is, as soon as they start moving into being uncontrollably sympathetically aroused, or they start collapsing into hypoarousal, what we know is that we've moved out of that threshold. And so this is where we come back to this point of going slow. And going slow becomes really, really important. When we're looking at somebody and we're in a processing area, that is to say we're doing the window of tolerance based memory extinguishment work, what we're really trying to do is touch in very slowly to the experience. So if trauma is an unclaimed experience, we're trying to help them have the experience. Right? So we're trying to help them have the experience. But we're trying to help them have the experience in extremely diluted parts. When I'm working with the person and I start seeing things like eyes darting or posture collapsing or any of these kind of things, that's an indication that the window of tolerance has been exceeded. But actually, most importantly, is when I feel them moving out of relationship with me. When I feel that they are unable to actually tolerate holding any kind of relational space, that's an indication that the window of tolerance is collapsing or on its way to collapsing. So that's my answer to Jackie's question. All right. Well, I'll do perhaps one more question, and we'll finish there. So I think there's meant to be a question here from Tara, but I don't seem to be able to see it. Oh, so Tara's question is: Tara is a therapist, a physiotherapist, and counsellor. She has a patient who has an acute childhood trauma at the age of 3. She describes that when she works with this person, she feels as if she's dealing with a small child, and this person has had a lifetime of psychological intervention with medication and cognitive behavioural therapy. The question is about how might we respond to, or how might we work with this person? Well, it's obviously a very difficult question without full history and understanding it, but I will use it as a springboard into perhaps exploring and talking about some of the ideas. First of all, the trauma that this person sustained at the age of 3 is a relationally based trauma. Has to do with her mother. These kinds of traumas, these kinds of experiences that occur so fundamentally early in people's self-development, create a kind of recursive narrative in the person. Also, people at this age, children at this age, are much more vulnerable to trauma, simply because they haven't developed the regulatory capacities of adults. So it's not just a question of grief, it's not just a question of something like that, it's more complex than that, in the sense that what happens is both the story of the sense of self and agency in that moment is conflated and connected to this terrible event, but also some of the practices and experiences of regulation which needed to be developed at that time simply haven't occurred. So when that happens, these parts, these experiences, these dimensions, whatever language you like to use to describe them, enter into the body, because we're talking about a period which is essentially before complex language. So these things aren't symbolized into normal linguistic function, rather they exist as symbols. Most often those symbols become symptoms. And that is to say that the trauma itself becomes sequestered in the body, unexperienced, unnamed, unfelt. The only felt quality of it, in some sense, is its absence or its lack, or the sense of what's missing. So when Tara is treating this person and she has this experience of dealing with a small child, I think we would say that we need to trust that. There's an invitation into what the body is requesting there. The body is requesting gentleness, tenderness, and safety. But the problem is, how do we actually go about treating that? Now, you can address these things in somatic ways, and of course, there's a great deal of therapy which is focused on working through the body. And any of the bodily based practices may be of use or help in terms of releasing and processing trauma. But the integration or the intersection between the mind and the body, if we're going to use that arbitrary distinction for a moment, really becomes the crucial part. Now, a lot of people will fixate on trying to generate a catharsis for this person. They want something big to happen, but that in fact is, in my opinion, the exact wrong way to go. Rather than trying to generate a cathartic huge event, what we need to do is we need to slow the process down, connect them into their body, and try and connect them into bodily safety, because that is essentially what Tara is describing this person as wanting and needing, which is safety. Once that safety is established, then what I would do is I'd set up resources. That is to say, I'd set up ways in which this person is able to move out of state. And we've always remember that states are associated with stories. So when we're treating somebody and they're in a frozen, shut down, traumatized state, that comes with a certain kind of story. So one of the first things I want to do is develop the resources to help this person shift state. Once they have experienced the relational safety, they have a set of resources which is added to their safety. It is then and only then that we then start to explore processing. And if you were using the body as a basis, you'd enter into the bodily based practices seeking to explore numbness, pain, tension, etc. And as those things were starting to be expressed and released, you'd then also be trying to verbalize and connect them to some sense of memory and story as best as you could. And then once those processes were extinguished, that is to say that the charge was let out of both the body and the affective kind of state of the person, sensate, affective and cognitive, once that had been essentially released, then the process would be focused on a kind of integrating narrative-based process, which you could use any kind of standardized talking therapy, which allows the person to narrativize their experience as a survivor. If you take something like narrative therapy, you'd be really trying to thicken up that part of the story. So that's my kind of quick response to a difficult question. Look, I think that's about half an hour or so now. So I think that's what we're scheduled for today. So thanks very much. I hope what I've shared today has been of interest to you and been helpful. We have training in Adelaide with the Healing Ground in June. If you'd like to get along to that, I'd love to see you all there. We'll explore a lot of these ideas in a great deal of detail, and there'll be plenty of space to focus on both the theoretical but also the clinical applications of this work. So thanks for taking the time to listen to me today, and I really look forward to seeing you all really soon. Thanks very much for your time. Thank you.